How the Civil War transformed American warfare forever. The American Civil War marked a turning point not only in the history of the United States, but in the evolution of warfare itself, transforming long-standing battlefield traditions into the foundation of modern combat. And from its earliest days, it became evident that this conflict would not resemble the limited, maneuver-based wars of the past, as new technology collided with outdated tactics in ways that produced staggering and often shocking consequences, forcing soldiers and commanders alike to confront a brutal new reality where survival depended not just on courage, but on adaptation, innovation, and an understanding of rapidly changing conditions. And as you begin this journey into one of history's most transformative conflicts, make sure to subscribe to American Global Force for more deep explorations into military power, strategy, and history, because the lessons of this war continue to shape the modern battlefield. Before the Civil War, armies across the world operated under the influence of Napoleonic warfare, a system built on discipline, coordination, and massed formations of soldiers who stood shoulder to shoulder in long lines, firing volleys at relatively close range. And this approach had been effective largely because of the limitations of the smoothbore musket, a weapon that was notoriously inaccurate beyond short distances and required soldiers to close in on the enemy to be effective. But the introduction of the rifled musket fundamentally changed this equation, as the grooves inside the barrel allowed bullets to spin and travel farther with greater accuracy, turning each individual soldier into a far more lethal force than ever before. And when combined with the devastating mini ball, which expanded upon impact and caused severe internal injuries, the battlefield became exponentially more dangerous, with soldiers now capable of killing enemies at distances of up to 500 yards, a range that rendered traditional tactics not just ineffective but suicidal. Yet despite this dramatic shift in firepower, many commanders initially failed to adjust their strategies, continuing to rely on mass charges and open field engagements that had worked in earlier conflicts. And the result was catastrophic, as thousands of soldiers were cut down in moments while advancing across exposed terrain, often before they even had a chance to fire, demonstrating the most brutal way possible that warfare had entered a new era. And one of the most striking examples of this deadly mismatch between old tactics and new technology can be seen in the Battle of Fredericksburg, where Union forces repeatedly assaulted well-defended Confederate positions, only to be met with devastating rifle and artillery fire that decimated their ranks and left the battlefield littered with casualties, serving as a grim reminder that courage alone could no longer overcome the power of modern weapons. And as these lessons were learned through bloodshed, soldiers on both sides began to adapt, increasingly seeking cover and constructing field fortifications to protect themselves from enemy fire, marking the beginning of a shift toward defensive warfare that would come to define much of the conflict. And this transformation was further accelerated by the development of rifled artillery, which extended the range and accuracy of cannons, allowing them to strike targets miles away with unprecedented precision, making it nearly impossible for large formations to maneuver safely in open terrain and forcing armies to rely on trenches, earthworks, and other defensive structures to survive. And as the war progressed, these fortifications became more elaborate and widespread, culminating in extensive trench systems that stretched across entire battlefronts, most notably during the Siege of Petersburg, where Union and Confederate forces dug in for months, creating a static and deadly environment that foreshadowed the trench warfare of the 20th century. And within these trenches, soldiers endured harsh conditions, constant traya, and relentless bombardment, highlighting not only the physical, but also the psychological toll of this new kind of warfare, where the enemy was often unseen and death could come at any moment, from a distant rifle or artillery shell. And this shift from open field battles to entrenched positions represented a fundamental change in how wars were fought, as the emphasis moved away from decisive engagements toward prolonged rehearsals and attrition, where victory depended on the ability to outlast and outmaneuver the enemy over time. And as commanders gradually recognized the implications of these changes, they began to experiment with new tactics and ran a TAN that took advantage of terrain, cover, and coordinated firepower, leading to a more sophisticated and methodical approach to combat that would influence military thinking for generations to come. And beyond the immediate battlefield, the increased lethality of weapons also had broader implications for the structure and organization of armies, as the need to manage larger numbers of casualties and maintain fighting forces required improvements in medical care, logistics, and communication, all of which contributed to the post-step evolution of modern military systems. And in this way, the Civil War served as a crucible in which the Puran methods of warfare were tested and ultimately transformed, giving rise to new doctrines and practices that would shape the future of conflict. And as we examine the events of this war, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in its outcome, but in the profound changes it brought about in the nature of warfare itself, changes that continue to influence how wars are fought and understood today, reminding us that the relationship between technology and tactics is one of constant tension and adaptation, and that the ability to recognize and respond to change is often the निर्णायक factor in determining success or failure on the battlefield, making the Civil War not just a chapter in history, but a turning point that redefined the very essence of war. As the American Civil War progressed beyond its opening clashes, it became increasingly clear that the conflict was being shaped not just by political will or military leadership, but by a dramatic and irreversible shift in the nature of battlefield firepower. And this transformation fundamentally altered the balance between offense and defense in ways that would permanently redefine how wars were fought, because for the first time in history, the lethality of infantry weapons had reached a point where traditional offensive tactics were no longer viable, forcing armies to abandon centuries-old doctrines and adapt to a new and far more dangerous reality in which survival depended on protection, positioning, and patience rather than speed and aggression. And this shift did not happen overnight, but emerged gradually through a series of bloody lessons learned on battlefields where outdated strategies met modern weaponry with devastating consequences. And at the heart of this transformation was the widespread adoption of the rifled musket, a weapon that revolutionized infantry combat by dramatically increasing both range and accuracy, allowing soldiers to strike targets at distances of up to 500 yards with a level of precision that had previously been unimaginable. And when paired with the mini ball, which expanded upon impact and inflicted catastrophic wounds, the result was a level of killing power that far exceeded anything seen in earlier conflicts, turning every soldier into a highly effective marksman capable of inflicting serious damage long before the enemy could close the distance. And yet, despite this dramatic increase in firepower, many commanders initially failed to recognize its implications, continuing to rely on massed formations and frontal assaults that had been effective during the era of smoothbore muskets. And this failure to adapt led to some of the most devastating casualties of the war, as soldiers advancing in tightly packed lines were cut down by concentrated rifle fire before they could even engage the enemy at close range, illustrating in the most brutal way possible that the rules of warfare had changed. And one of the most telling examples of this deadly mismatch can be seen in the Battle of Cold Harbor, where Union forces launched a series of frontal assaults against well-entrenched Confederate positions and suffered thousands of casualties in a matter of minutes, demonstrating the overwhelming advantage of defensive positions in the face of modern firepower, and as such experiences accumulated. Soldiers and officers alike began to understand that survival on the battlefield required a new approach, one that emphasized the use of cover, concealment, and fortification to reduce exposure to enemy fire. And this realization led to the widespread adoption of field fortifications, including trenches, earthworks, and breastworks, which provided essential protection against bullets and artillery shells. And these defensive structures quickly became a defining feature of the war, transforming the landscape of battlefields into networks of fortified positions that stretched across miles of terrain, creating a static and often deadly environment where movement was limited and progress was slow. And the shift toward defensive warfare was further reinforced by the continued development of artillery, particularly the introduction of rifled cannons, which extended the range and accuracy of artillery fire to unprecedented levels, allowing commanders to target enemy positions from miles away and making it even more dangerous for troops to operate in open ground. And as a result, the battlefield became increasingly dominated by long-range firepower, where visibility, positioning, and timing were often more important than sheer numbers or bravery. And this new reality forced armies to adopt more cautious and deliberate tactics, focusing on coordinated movements, reconnaissance, and the careful use of terrain to gain an advantage over the enemy. And in many cases, battles evolved into prolonged engagements, characterized by skirmishing, artillery duels, and incremental advances rather than decisive clashes, reflecting a broader shift in the nature of warfare from one of rapid maneuver to one of sustained pressure and attrition. And this transformation reached its peak during the later stages of the war, particularly in campaigns such as the Overland Campaign, where Union and Confederate forces engaged in a series of brutal and continuous battles that emphasized endurance and resilience over decisive victory. And throughout this campaign, both sides made extensive use of entrenchments and defensive positions, demonstrating that the lessons of earlier battles had been learned, even if they came at a terrible cost. And beyond the immediate tactical implications, the rise of defensive warfare also had significant psychological effects on soldiers, as the constant threat of long-range fire and the need to remain under cover for extended periods created a sense of tienav and poi that was very different from the more direct and immediate dangers of earlier conflicts. And life in the trenches was often characterized by cathor conditions, including exposure to the elements, limited supplies, and the ever-present danger of a Kayank attack, or artillery bombardment, all of which contributed to the Mayansik strain of the war and highlighted the human cost of this new style of combat. And at the same time, the increasing importance of defensive tactics also influenced the development of military engineering, as both sides invested significant resources in the design and construction of fortifications that could withstand sustained fire, leading to innovations in trench design. The use of Prakritic obstacles and the integration of artillery into defensive positions, all of which would later be refined and expanded upon in future conflicts, particularly during World War I, where trench warfare became the dominant form of combat on the Western Front. And in this way, the Civil War served as a crucial testing ground for the concepts and techniques that would define modern warfare, demonstrating that the balance between offense and defense had shifted in favor of the latter, and that success on the battlefield increasingly depended on the ability to adapt to this new reality. And as commanders continued to grapple with the implications of these changes, they began to develop new reanitiae and that combined defensive strength with offensive AVCR, seeking to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's lines while minimizing their own exposure to fire, leading to a more nuanced and flexible approach to warfare that emphasized coordination, timing, and the effective use of resources. And ultimately, the rise of defensive warfare during the Civil War represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of combat, one that challenged long-held assumptions about how wars should be fought and forced armies to rethink their strategies in light of new technological realities. And as we look back on this period, it is clear that the lessons learned on these battlefields have had a lasting impact, shaping the development of military doctrine and influencing the way wars are fought to this day, reminding us that the evolution of warfare is a continuous process driven by the interplay between technology, tactics, and human ingenuity, and that the ability to adapt to changing circumstances is often the key to survival and success in the face of overwhelming odds. As the American Civil War deepened in intensity and scale, it became increasingly clear that this was not merely a contest of armies clashing on battlefields, but a sinews defined by the QDRA of each side to mobilize, sustain, and coordinate vast industrial and logistical systems. And in this sense, the war marked one of the earliest and most significant examples of industrialized warfare in human history, where the shti of factories, transportation networks, and communication technologies played a निर्णायक role in shaping outcomes, fundamentally transforming the way wars were fought and won, because for the first time, success depended not only on tactical brilliance or the bravery of soldiers, but on the ability of an entire nation to function as a machine, producing weapons, moving armies, and maintaining supply lines over immense distances. And this signaled a decisive shift away from earlier conflicts, where armies often relied on local resources and limited infrastructure, toward a modern model in which became a complex system of interconnected processes involving industry and innovation. And at the heart of this transformation were the railroads, which emerged as one of the most critical of war, revolutionizing military logistics by enabling the rapid and efficient movement of troops, artillery, and supplies across vast territories, effectively shrinking the size of the battlefield and allowing commanders to respond to threats and opportunities with unprecedented speed. And this capability provided a significant strategic advantage, particularly for the Union, which possessed a more extensive and rail network than the Confederacy, allowing it to reinforce positions, launch coordinated offensives, and sustain large armies in the field over long periods. And railroads also became prime targets for military operations, as both sides recognized that disrupting the enemy's transportation could cripple their ability to wage war, leading to numerous campaigns focused on capturing or destroying key rail and junctions. And this focus on infrastructure highlighted the extent to which industrial systems had become integrated into military strategy, transforming the battlefield into a space where economic and logistical considerations were just as important as tactical ones. And alongside the railroads, the telegraph emerged as another transformative technology that reshaped the nature of command and control, enabling near-instant communication over long distances, and allowing military and political leaders to coordinate their actions with a level of speed and precision that had never been possible before. And this innovation fundamentally changed the relationship between the battlefield and the home front, as leaders such as Abraham Lincoln could remain actively involved in military decision-making, receiving real-time updates from commanders and issuing orders that influenced the course of campaigns from hundreds of miles away, creating a echo of centralized control that redefined military lekidi and allowed for more cohesive and coordinated strategies. And this integration of communication technology also reduced the likelihood of miscommunication and delays, enabling armies to operate more effectively and adapt quickly to changing prestigio, which was crucial in a LHRB, where SRH and coordination often determined success or failure, and beyond transportation and communication. The Civil War also underscored the critical importance of industrial production in sustaining a modern army, as the sheer scale of the conflict required an enormous output of weapons, ammunition, uniforms, food supplies, and medical equipment. And this demand drove the expansion of factories and the development of more efficient manufacturing processes, particularly in the North, where industrial capacity far exceeded that of the Confederacy, allowing the Union to equip its forces with more advanced and reliable equipment, maintain consistent supply lines, and replace losses more effectively. And this industrial advantage extended beyond weapons to include every aspect of military logistics, from the production of rail engines and telegraph wires to the printing of maps and orders, all of which contributed to the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the Union war effort. And in contrast, the Confederacy faced significant challenges in this area, struggling with shortages of raw materials, limited manufacturing capacity, and a reliance on imports that were often disrupted by Union blockades, which placed it at a considerable disadvantage as the war continued. And this disparity in industrial shakti became increasingly evident over time, as the Union's ability to sustain prolonged campaigns and replenish its resources allowed it to maintain pressure on Confederate forces, gradually wearing them down in a war of attrition that favored the side with greater resources and LNT Kasemte. And another crucial aspect of industrial integration during the Civil War was the development of organized supply systems, which ensured that troops in the field received the resources they needed to continue fighting. And this involved the creation of complex logistical networks that coordinated the movement of goods from factories to rail depots and eventually to the front lines, requiring careful planning, elders, and coordination to function effectively. And the scale of these operations was unprecedented, with entire departments dedicated to overseeing supply chains, transportation, and distribution, reflecting a growing recognition that logistics was not merely a supporting function, but a central component of military shakti. And this realization would go on to influence military doctrine in the decades that followed, as future armies placed increasing emphasis on the importance of logistics in achieving svoltae on the battlefield. And in addition to these developments, the Civil War also saw early experimentation with aerial reconnaissance, particularly through the use of hot air balloons, which were deployed to observe enemy movements and gather intelligence from above, providing commanders with valuable information that could be used to plan and execute operations more effectively. And although these balloons were relatively primitive compared to modern aircraft, they represented an important step toward the integration of aerial surveillance into military strategy, demonstrating the potential of new technologies to enhance situational awareness and improve decision-making. And this LBTKR highlighted the broader trend of technological experimentation that characterized the Civil War. As both sides sought to gain an advantage by adopting new tools and techniques, and the combination of railroads, telegraphy, industrial production, and reconnaissance created a level of operational capability that was unprecedented in the history of warfare, allowing armies to coordinate their actions across vast distances, sustain prolonged campaigns, and adapt to changing prestigio with greater speed and efficiency than ever before. And this transformation had profound implications not only for the outcome of the Civil War, but for the future of warfare as a whole, as it established a new model in which industrial shakti and organizational kazmte were as important as tactical skill and battlefield bravery. And as nations around the world observed the height of the conflict, they began to recognize the mai of developing their own industrial and logistical capabilities in order to compete in this new era of warfare, leading to a global shift toward more industrialized and vevsidit military systems that would define the conflicts of the 20th century and beyond. And ultimately, the integration of industrial shakti into military operations during the Civil War not only changed how wars were fought, but also redefined the relationship between society and the military, demonstrating that in modern warfare, the entire nation becomes part of the war effort, and that victory depends on the QRH to mobilize, sustain, and coordinate resources on a scale that extends far beyond the battlefield, making the Civil War not just a conflict between armies, but a Nirnayak moment in the history of human organization, technology, and shakti. And as the lessons of this war continued to resonate in the years that followed, they laid the groundwork for the Ionic concept of total war, where economic shakti, industrial output, and logistical efficiency became the Nirnayak factors in determining the outcome of conflicts, ensuring that the legacy of the Civil War would endure not only in the itihas of the United States, but in the evolution of warfare across the world. The Revolution at Sea. While the American Civil War is often remembered for its brutal land campaigns and transformative battlefield tactics, an equally profound revolution was unfolding along the rivers, coastlines, and open waters, where naval warfare underwent a dramatic and irreversible transformation that would forever alter the balance of power at sea, marking the end of the age of wooden sailing ships and the beginning of a new era defined by iron, steam, and technological innovation. And this pivot did not emerge gradually over decades, but rather exploded into reality within the span of a few intense years, driven by necessity, experimentation, and the relentless LDGT of war, as both the Union and the Confederacy sought new ways to gain an advantage in a time years where control of waterways could determine the NJH or failure of entire campaigns. And at the heart of this naval revolution was the jur of ironclad warships, vessels armored with iron plating that rendered traditional wooden ships obsolete almost overnight, fundamentally changing naval combat by introducing a level of protection and firepower that had never before been seen. And this transformation reached its defining moment in 1862 with a historic clash between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, an engagement that not only demonstrated the superiority of iron over wood, but also signaled the nhaya of an era that had dominated naval warfare for centuries, as cannonballs that would have shattered wooden hulls simply bounced off iron armor, rendering traditional naval tactics ineffective and forcing naval Ranitik thinkers to reconsider every aspect of ship design and combat. And one of the most significant innovations introduced during this battle was the revolving turret of the Monitor, a design that allowed its guns to rotate independently of the ship's movement, providing greater flexibility and enabling it to fire in any dishaye without needing to maneuver the entire vessel. And this concept would go on to influence naval engineering for generations, becoming a defining feature of modern warships. And beyond the introduction of ironclads, the Civil War also saw the rapid adoption of steam power as a primary means of propulsion, replacing the reliance on wind that had governed naval écurque for centuries. And this shift provided ships with greater GTI, nitrogen, and reliability, allowing them to operate independently of weather conditions and maneuver more effectively in combat, further enhancing their strategic value and reinforcing the hmai of technological innovation in naval warfare. And in addition to these advances, The Civil War also witnessed the emergence of entirely new forms of naval combat, including the use of submarines and underwater explosives, which added a new dimension of ktria and unpredictability to maritime lumlet. And one of the most notable examples of this innovation was the CSS H.L. Hunley, which became the first submarine in history to successfully sink an enemy warship, demonstrating the potential of underwater warfare and opening the door to future developments in submarine technology that would play a critical role in conflicts such as World War I and World War II. And although the Hunley itself was a relatively primitive vessel, its success proved that the concept of submarine warfare was not only viable, but potentially devastating, forcing naval forces to consider new defensive strategies and technologies to counter this emerging threat. And alongside submarines, the use of naval mines, then referred to as torpedoes, became increasingly common during the Civil War, posing a significant threat to ships navigating contested waters and forcing commanders to adopt more cautious and analytic approaches to movement and lumlet, as these hidden explosives could inflict severe damage or destroy a vessel without warning, adding an NSER of uncertainty that further complicated naval warfare. And the integration of these technologies transformed naval combat into a far more complex and multifaceted endeavor, where success depended not only on firepower and maneuverability, but also on innovation, intelligence, and the ability to anticipate and counter new threats. And the strategic MHTV of naval shakti during the Civil War extended beyond individual battles, as control of rivers and coastlines played a crucial role in determining the outcome of campaigns, particularly in the Western Theater, where the Union's dominance of the Mississippi River effectively split the Confederacy in two and disrupted its ability to coordinate and supply its forces, demonstrating the near-nigh impact of naval operations on the broader course of the war. And this voltaire was made possible in part by the Union's ability to leverage its industrial advantage to build and deploy a large and technologically advanced navy capable of enforcing blockades, supporting ground LQWT, and projecting shakti across vast Kazetron, and the Union blockade of Confederate ports, often referred to as the Anaconda Plan, aimed to strangle the Southern economy by preventing the export of cotton and the import of essential goods, and over time, this strategy proved highly effective, weakening the Confederacy's economic base and limiting its ability to sustain the war effort, highlighting the MHTV of economic warfare as a component of modern military strategy. And at the same time, the Confederacy sought to counter this blockade through the use of commerce raiders and innovative ship designs, attempting to disrupt Union shipping and undermine its economic shakti. And while these efforts achieved some success, they were ultimately insufficient to overcome the Union's overwhelming naval superiority, underscoring the importance of Sansaden, Udyog, and Sungthan in determining the outcome of modern conflicts. And the Civil War's naval revolution also had a lasting impact on global naval development, as nations around the world, Nematel No observed the innovations and lessons emerging from the conflict, recognizing that the future of naval warfare lay in the integration of iron armor, steam propulsion, and advanced weaponry. And this realization sparked a wave of naval modernization that reshaped fleets across Europe and beyond, leading to the construction of new classes of warships designed to incorporate these technologies and adapt to the changing nature of maritime combat. And in this way, the Civil War served as a catalyst for a global transformation in naval warfare, accelerating the decline of traditional corabli and ushering in a new era of industrialized naval shakti that would dominate the world's oceans for decades to come. And as we reflect on the significance of this pivot, it becomes clear that the Althor at sea during the Civil War was not merely a series of technological advancements, but a fundamental shift in the principles of naval warfare, one that redefined the relationship between technology, strategy, and established a new paradigm in which innovation and adaptability were the keys to, and this legacy continues to influence naval operations today, as modern navies continue to evolve and incorporate new technologies in their quest for superiority, demonstrating that the lessons of the Civil War remain as relevant now as they were more than a century ago, reminding us that the nature of warfare is constantly changing, and that those who fail to adapt to new realities risk being left behind in the face of relentless progress. As the American Civil War entered its later and most phases, it became increasingly evident that the traditional objective of defeating an enemy army in a single, decisive battle was no longer sufficient to secure victory, and this realization gave rise to a profound transformation in military strategy, one that would redefine not only how the war was fought, but how wars would be conceived in the modern era as commanders began to understand that success required the systematic destruction of the enemy's entire capacity to wage war, including its QTSD, infrastructure, and civilian morale. And the shift toward what would later be known as total war represented a radical departure from earlier Sinai doctrines, which had often sought to limit the scope of conflict and avoid unnecessary destruction beyond the battlefield. But the scale, intensity, and duration of the Civil War made such MHWD approaches impractical, forcing leaders to adopt more comprehensive and often more brutal strategies in order to bring the conflict to an end. And among the birth figures associated with this teach will was William T. Sherman, whose campaign through the Confederacy, known as the March to the Sea, became one of the most iconic and controversial examples of total war in action, as his forces advanced from Atlanta to Savannah, systematically destroying railroads, factories, crops, and other resources that could support the Confederate war effort, leaving a trail of devastation designed not only to cripple the South's military capabilities, but also to break the will of its people to continue fighting. And this strategy reflected a growing recognition that modern wars were not fought solely by armies, but by entire societies, and that weakening the enemy's QTSDY and Samajic foundations could be just as effective as defeating its soldiers on the battlefield. And while Sherman's campaign was highly effective in achieving its HDF, it also raised significant ethical questions about the conduct of war, particularly regarding the targeting of civilian property and the impact of such actions on non-combatants. And these questions remain relevant today, as modern scry planners continued to grapple with the balance between military necessity and humanitarian considerations. And alongside the development of total war, the Civil War also saw the increasing professionalization of the military, as the sheer scale and complexity of the conflict required more organized and systematic approaches to training, elkid, and logistics, leading to the establishment of standardized procedures and the chin of military institutions that would form the foundation of modern armed forces. And one of the most important developments in this area was the creation of more efficient logistical systems, which enabled armies to sustain prolonged campaigns and maintain their fighting capacity over extended periods, ensuring that troops were adequately supplied with food, ammunition, and equipment. And this emphasis on logistics reflected a broader shift in military thinking, as commanders came to understand that the ability to sustain operations over time was just as important as the ability to win battles. And in addition to logistical improvements, the Civil War also saw significant advances in medical care and battlefield organization, including the development of organized ambulance corps and the establishment of more systematic methods for treating and evacuating wounded soldiers, which helped to reduce MRTYU rates and improve overall SANI effectiveness. And these innovations represented an important step toward the development of modern military medicine, highlighting the importance of caring for soldiers not only as fighters, but as individuals whose survival and recovery were critical to the smear of the war effort, and at the same time, the increasing lethality of weapons and the adoption of more destructive strategies resulted in an unprecedented human cost as the Civil War became one of the deadliest conflicts in American history, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers losing their lives and countless others suffering from wounds, disease, and psychological trauma, and the scale of this suffering underscored the devastating impact of modern warfare, where advances in technology and strategy could lead to greater efficiency in killing, but also to greater levels of destruction and human misery. And for the soldiers on the front lines, the experience of war was often defined by a combination of fear, exhaustion, and resilience, as they endured harsh conditions, constant danger, and the emotional toll of witnessing the death and suffering of their comrades. And these experiences had a lasting impact on those who survived, shaping their perspectives and influencing the way they understood the world around them. And beyond the battlefield, the LHRB also had profound effects on civilian populations, particularly in the South, where the destruction of infrastructure and resources disrupted daily life and created widespread hardship. And the Union blockade further exacerbated these difficulties by limiting access to essential goods, contributing to economic decline and saamajic tanav. And this VIOP impact of the war highlighted the interconnected nature of modern conflict, where the KHTWT between military and civilian spheres became increasingly blurred, and where the effects of LHRB were felt far beyond the immediate zone of combat. And as the Civil War drew toward its conclusion, it became clear that the strategies and innovations developed BMMOLKH, the conflict had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare, establishing new principles that would shape future conflicts, including the of targeting an enemy's economic and Sandy base, the need for efficient logistical systems, and the role of civilian morale in determining the outcome of war. And these lessons would go on to influence military Latvkire in the decades that followed, particularly during the major conflicts of the 20th century, where the concept of total war became a defining characteristic of global singers. And in this way, the Civil War not only determined the future of the United States, but also contributed to the evolution of warfare on a Guinea scale, demonstrating that the pursuit of victory in modern conflicts often requires a comprehensive and coordinated approach that extends far beyond the battlefield, and that the costs of such conflicts, both in terms of human lives and societal impact, are often immense and far-reaching, reminding us that while war may drive innovation and change, it also carries with it a profound and enduring legacy of suffering that must be acknowledged and understood. As the American Civil War came to its conclusion, the smoke of battle slowly cleared to reveal not just a reunited nation, but a fundamentally transformed understanding of warfare that would echo far beyond the HDBD of the United States, shaping military thought, doctrine, and innovation for generations to come. And in examining the legacy of this conflict, it becomes clear that the Civil War was not simply a war of its time, but a bridge between eras, linking the traditional Yud practices of the past with the industrialized, Renitic, and technology-driven conflicts of the modern world. And this transformation was not confined to a single aspect of warfare, but encompassed every dimension, from tactics and technology to logistics, liquidae, and the relationship between society and the military, creating a new paradigm that would define how wars were fought in the decades and centuries that followed. And one of the most enduring lessons of the Civil War was the recognition that technological innovation can dramatically outpace existing military doctrine, creating a dangerous gap that, if not addressed, can lead to catastrophic consequences, as seen in the Pari casualties resulting from the continued use of mass formations against rifled weapons, and this lesson would be revisited time and again in later conflicts, particularly during the early stages of World War I, where European armies initially relied on outdated tactics in the face of machine guns and artillery, leading to similarly devastating losses. And in this way, the Civil War served as an early warning about the importance of adapting quickly to new technologies, emphasizing that flexibility and innovation are critical to success on the battlefield. And another key legacy of the war was the integration of industrial shakti into military operations, which demonstrated that modern warfare is as much about production, logistics, and infrastructure as it is about combat itself. And this realization led to the development of more sophisticated systems for managing resources, coordinating supply chains, and sustaining large Saini forces over extended periods, laying the groundwork for the Vishay al-Yud efforts of the 20th century, where entire economies were mobilized to support military operations, and the role of communication technologies, particularly the telegraph, also had a lasting impact, highlighting the importance of real-time information and centralized command in coordinating complex operations. And this concept would continue to evolve with the advent of radio, satellites, and digital communication systems, further enhancing the acute array of Saini leaders to manage forces across vast distances. And in addition to these technological and organizational advancements, the Civil War also contributed to the professionalization of the military, as the scale and complexity of the conflict necessitated more structured training, standardized procedures, and improved leadership development, leading to the establishment of institutions and doctrines that would shape modern armed forces. And this professionalization was essential in enabling militaries to operate effectively in an increasingly complex and demanding environment, where coordination, discipline, and expertise were paramount. And the LHRB also underscored the hum-in of total war as a strategic concept, demonstrating that victory often requires targeting not just the enemy's military forces, but their economic base and civilian morale, a lesson that would be applied in later conflicts such as World War II, where strategic bombing campaigns and economic blockades played a निर्णायक role in determining outcomes. And while these strategies proved effective, they also raised MHTV-purn ethical questions about the conduct of war and the impact on civilian populations, questions that continue to be debated in modern military and political discourse. And the human cost of the Civil War further reinforced the need for advancements in military medicine and the treatment of wounded Sainikon, leading to improvements in medical care, sanitar vyvstha, and the organization of field hospitals, which helped to reduce mortality rates and improve the chances of survival for Gael soldiers. And these developments laid the foundation for modern military medicine, which continues to evolve in response to the challenges of contemporary warfare. And beyond the immediate military implications, the Civil War also had a profound impact on the broader relationship between society and the military, as it demonstrated that modern wars require the mobilization of entire populations, not just armies, and that the KH2WT between civilian and military roles can become increasingly blurred in times of conflict. And this avdaha anaya of total mobilization would become a defining characteristic of 20th century warfare, where governments implemented policies to coordinate industry, labor, and resources in support of military objectives. And in reflecting on the legacy of the Civil War, it is also important to consider its influence on global military lefker, as nations around the Duniyaya Vnimatel studied the conflict and incorporated its lessons into their own Saini doctrines, recognizing the MHTV of industrial shtiai, logistical efficiency, and technological innovation in achieving success on the battlefield. And this global Tathir contributed to the rapid modernization of militaries in Europe and beyond, setting the stage for the large-scale conflicts that would define the modern era. And at the same time, the Civil War serves as a powerful reminder of the human consequences of warfare, as the advancements in technology and strategy that made armies more effective also made them more destructive, increasing the scale and intensity of suffering experienced by soldiers and civilians alike. And this dual nature of progress in warfare, where innovation can lead to both greater efficiency and greater devastation, continues to shape the way we think about military shikii and its role in the world. And as we consider the lessons of the Civil War today, it becomes clear that its lies not only in its historical context, but in its enduring relevance, offering insights into the challenges and complexities of modern warfare and the importance of balancing technological advancement with ethical considerations. And in this sense, the Civil War remains a vital entafia of reference for understanding the evolution of conflict and the MSWL that comes with wielding military shikii in an increasingly interconnected and technologically advanced world. And as you reach the conclusion of this in-depth exploration, remember that history is not just a record of the past, but a guide to the future. And the lessons learned from the Civil War continue to inform the strategies, technologies, and decisions that shape our world today. So if you found this breakdown insightful and powerful, don't forget to subscribe to American Global Force for more content that uncovers the hidden forces behind military strength, unity, and global power. And stay connected as we continue to explore the stories that define our world.